Hey guys, we're live here for Noetic, and we're doing another installment where I have someone teach me some poetry. And today our guest is Lindsay O'Connor. I'm just going to hand it over to her. Lindsay, thank you for teaching us.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. I today want to look at one of Emily Dickinson's poems, one of her favorites of mine. But in the process of looking at it, I want this to sort of be a lesson on how to approach a poem. So if you've a poem that you've never seen before, a poet that you may not be familiar with, what to do when faced with like this potentially strange and intimidating object. So I want us to look at poem 591. Emily Dickinson's poems none of them are titled. They just have numbers, or people kind of know them by their first line. So this is, I heard a fly buzz when I died. That might be how this one is known. So before we even read it aloud or start talking about it, I want you, Luke, to just look at it on your screen or on your page, however you have it, and tell me a little bit about what you notice. So.
All right. I mean, look, I'm completely untutored in the poetical arts, so I'll do my best to kind of just tell you what a layperson sees when they see this on a computer screen or on the page. Presumably, it's presented in the same format. What I'm seeing that jumps out to me is unusual capitalization in the title. If this was a bit of an eye test, I would notice that at the optometrist. As I go further down that eye test, I notice there's a lot of hyphenation throughout the four stanzas. That seems to me to be unusual. Those are the major things that jump out at me. I'm sure there are more obvious things like is this, can I ask what form of verse this is written in, or am I not allowed to ask a question?
You can ask, yeah, whatever you want. You know, this doesn't have to be that strict. But yeah, I think that one of the things I was going to kind of push back at you was like, you're pointing to things that are unusual, right? And so like, you're not an untutored layperson, right? If you already have a sense of what is usual, right? Of what a poem should be, because you're already telling me how this is strange, right? Like how this is different than your expectations, right? So you do bring like some kind of expectations to this thing, right? And one of them, which totally makes sense, is that it shouldn't be covered in dashes, right? Like I don't think there's a period in this entire poem. I think that's right, right? The only punctuation is the dash, right? Over a 16-line poem, right? So that is pretty weird, right? And definitely something we'll talk about. And then yeah, as far as form, so it's not like it's a sonnet or a villanelle or something like that, but it certainly does have a particular verse structure. So is there anything just by looking at the length of the lines or anything that you can kind of get from it as far as that structure? What do you notice about like line length, I guess?
It seems like the odd lines are longer than the even lines.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So for the most part, that's what you'll see, but they're not that much longer, right? Like it mostly looks like a rectangle on the page made of 4 smaller rectangles, right? Like it's not like you have any kind of line that's like hanging all the way over to the right margin, and the next one's only 2 words long.
It's pretty evenly distributed along that form.
And so, but I think precisely because you're seeing the lines like that, like that's a way to know that it probably does have a structure, right? Or at least has a meter, or like there's something going on that's like pretty tightly structuring this thing, right? Like this is probably not going to be a free verse poem, because it's in the free verse poem where you're going to get that like much stranger kind of stuff, right? Where you're going to have these short lines and long lines and like things that are hanging over and all that kind of stuff, right? So I just wanted to kind of like go through that, so that like that's like setting the scene for like coming into this poem and like how you might read it and what it might have to share with you, I guess. So would you give it a go reading it aloud?
Sure. Is the proper way, I just want to make sure, I know there's usually a convention for how to read a poem. Is it always the case that you sort of read the title, then the author, and then read the title and the author again, or just at the beginning, or does it matter?
So that's an interesting question. I'm not sure that there's like a real, I feel like people usually would read the title and the author at the start, but with Emily Dickinson, it's strange because none of them are titled. So like whatever page you're looking at, it probably does say, I heard a fly buzz, right? But that's not like, she didn't write that title at the top of the poem, right? And so there's a little bit of like, you know, editorial choice or whatever that's been made and you know, we need a shorthand for the poem, and like that's going to be a much easier one to remember than like poem number 591 or whatever it is. So I feel like with Dickinson would probably just say the number and then start reading the poem, because reading the title and then reading, you know, you're just reading the first line again. So
that was something, and I don't know if this reflects like different editions or something like that, because I did a little bit of research on Emily Dickinson's background, not very much. I scanned like 3 pages on Wikipedia, but from what I found in that biographical information, you know, it told me that she didn't publish a lot during her life, and then a cache of her poems were found and then sort of published posthumously. That's and I believe some big anthology of her poems came out in 1955, and I'm looking at the poets.org website, and they have it labeled 465.
Yeah, I have 465, and when we were talking about this previously, that's what I had, and now I'm looking at some old photocopies I have from when I taught this poem a long time ago, and I'm ashamed to say I actually don't quite know what they're from, but it's labeled as 591. And in all my notes about it, it's labeled as 591. I want to say that it was in like the 1990s that there was like a reshuffling, where like some kind of original order to her poems was restored. So I'm not entirely clear on the publication editorial history of everything, but it does sound like there's been some debate and some changes. Because we'll get to it with the dashes, but there's definitely been some changes in like how the orthography was represented, like because everything was handwritten, you know, and then somebody had to type all this stuff up. So there've been some interesting changes that like now I think the dashes are like restored from the original, but I think when things were originally published, that was all kind of taken out and it was like made more regular. So there's lots of interesting history there. So I just read it. At this point you can just read the poem since we know who we're talking about.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I heard a fly buzz, 465 or 591, Emily Dickinson. Okay. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breasts were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsakes, signed away, what portions of me be assignable, and then it was these interposed a fly, with blue, uncertain stumbling buzz, between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. That was terrible. I did a terrible version of that. So monotone, and I didn't read it.
You're giving us a lot to work with, Luke. It's gonna be fine. Tell me why you think it was terrible. Let's dwell in that.
I think I read this poem a couple times last night, and I read it aloud, and I last night, and I read it more dramatically and enjoyed it much more. I'm just not awake enough to understand even what I'm doing. But the reason why I think I didn't do a good job here is because I got caught up on the hyphens. I was tripping over myself now that I'm consciously aware of them. And it prevented me from imbuing it with any sort of dramatized significance. So I feel like I read it like a bad robot. But the other times where I recited it to myself, I was like, wow, this poem is really lovely. I'm glad Lindsay chose this one.
Okay, well, we will read it again in just a minute. Okay, so the dashes were something that tripped you up, it sounds like, or that like you really noted, like you let them run the show, it sounds like, right? Like you were kind of stopping, and you were stopping, because not all lines end with a dash, right? You were also end stopping the lines, right? Like that's
I wasn't in the right places either.
Okay, right. So, but that's like an interesting thing to think about, right? Is that like, I can read it the second time maybe, and I will give it I'll do it differently, and we can kind of talk about how like the poem maybe is like trying to interrupt you, right? Like those dashes are like, you can read them as being a thing that connects, I think, or you can read them as a disruption because they're this like line in the, you know, like it's not what you expect to see there, right? Like they're an ambiguous form of punctuation because they're not used in a way that like anybody is really familiar with, right? Like they're the only form of punctuation, so they're doing the work of like commas, of periods, of semicolons, maybe of also dashes, but like what do dashes even do anyway, right? So there's something there about the poem like maybe trying to like make things a little bit weird for you, right?
So am I even permitted to ask at this stage, or will this be interrupting your particular flow? Like why she does this, and what your interpretation is of how we're supposed to deal with these dashes?
Yeah. So I think that there's different theories or whatever about why she uses the dashes. I guess I personally tend to try to take them as being a kind of shorthand for a connection across things that might be disparate, and not in every single moment, but like in general, like Emily Dickinson is the woman who uses all the dashes, you know, like that's like this thing that she's known as. And one of the things that I will continue to talk about as we actually get into, I know it's taking a while for us to actually get into what this poem is about, or what it says, what it contains, like one of the things I do want to talk about is like the way that she makes these like oblique or the connections across things can be a little bit sloppy, but in a good way. Like she's making connections between things that are disparate, that you wouldn't normally see as like, right? And I think that's something that's happening in the form, and it's also something that's happening with like the particular images that she's putting next to each other. So I don't know if that really answers the dash question. But something I would say in general about poetry, and particularly about Emily Dickinson, right, is that like, if you don't understand something, or if you find a difficulty in something, right, whether it's like not understanding how to read the poem aloud or not understanding what she's saying, like it's not because you're dumb, right? Like dwell on that, like think about why it's hard, and like, you know, like, there's probably some reason why there's an obstacle there, right? Like, because I mean, poetry can be, you know, in some of its most beautiful moments, like poetry is about like making these like incredible connections, right? And making something incredibly clear, right? But oftentimes it's also difficult, right? Like there's like a kind of, I don't know, like payoff to like working through something, or like being able to make these like connections across disparate things can be a difficult task, right? That poetry like rewards you with or something. Okay, so, right, so the dashes, the end stop, stopping at the ends of lines, right? What did you catch as far as the meter or a kind of rhythm to the poem? Like, did each stanza sound the same? Like, did you find yourself kind of coming into any kind of cadence, or did you find that that was just like you couldn't do that because of the punctuation?
I think because I got hung up on the punctuation, I was too distracted from actually doing it properly.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'll read it again, and we'll see if we can maybe kind of like get through some of this like sound stuff when I read it. So
I'm sure.
Okay. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portions of me be assignable, and then it was there interposed a fly, with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. Okay.
That was pretty perfect. That was pretty.
Thank you. I almost got over my lisp on breaths. So I've been practicing.
Yesterday I did a seminar, and I still can't say, well, maybe I could do it today, but I had to listen to the pronunciation of the ancient Greek philosopher Anaxagoras like 15 times for me to say it. I cannot say that word Anaxagoras, or that philosopher's name Anaxagoras.
Yeah, that's not how I know that word. I would not have come up with Anaxagoras if I had to just read it from the page. So there's like that thing about, you know, how people, one of the books in my dissertation, actually, there's a character who has read a lot, but he hasn't talked to a lot of people. And when he goes out in the world and he starts using all these big words that he knows from books, he pronounces them all wrong, and everyone thinks he's crazy, or like just like really nerdy. And so, are you saying myself like you shouldn't feel bad for like mispronouncing things if you just know them from like, you know.
So you're saying that's me?
No, that's you. I'm saying you're like this weird character who goes and works at a theme park and whatever. In my
as far as this goes, I noticed that the hyphens didn't seem to affect the way that you read this, or at least that's how it seemed to me. Like you kind of kept on trucking. You didn't let this unusual punctuation disrupt your flow. So then I'm kind of curious how you know how you developed your flow for this poem.
Yeah. So the answer to that is the poem has a very regular meter. And so I was reading with the meter, like I was letting that be what for the most part, like what carried me. And so I think that you were like, I was thinking more about sound, I think, maybe. Whereas I have the suspicion that you were like, what does this mean? Like, what is this? Does this connect to this other thing? That you were a little bit more in like the semantics, right?
Totally.
And I was much more in the like, this line is gonna rhyme, it should rhyme with this line 2 lines later, and like there's this like, you know, I know the meter here, right? And so what everybody was hearing, I guess, when I read it, hopefully, is what's called ballad meter. So I just want to explain that a little bit, right? So the lines, as you pointed out when you were looking at it, just visually, right? The first of every stanza, the first and third lines, right, have 8 syllables. And then the second and fourth lines have 6 syllables, and it's iambic. So it's 4 iambs and then it's 3 iambs, right? 4 3 4 3. So 4 stresses in the first line, 3 stresses, 4 stresses, 3 stresses, right? Really thinking the stresses is what matters kind of the most, right?
Can I ask a really bonehead question? Is a stress just like, is that, what exactly is a stress? Is that just like?
Yeah. Ask Hunt. I don't. It's where this is tough because it's like the response I'm like, you know, the easy response to give is that it's like where emphasis in like natural speech naturally falls, right? But we all intone things differently, right? Like there's like a continuing debate about up-talking, right? Mm-hmm. In a way, up-talking is, which I do very much, you know, that is a sort of like change in pitch, and it can change the stress of the things that we're saying, and you're kind of saying it in like unusual ways, right? So it's like, it's just where you put the emphasis. And I don't know that I have a good enough sense of meter or of even just like sound to explain like what stress is, you know? It's just like, you know, it's that thing, it's that sound, and that's totally unhelpful.
No, it's fine. That's fine. So, I mean, I'm completely okay with ambiguity. It's not like a poem has to be a math problem for me.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So like, if I were to have someone else look at this poem, and you guys were to, is it correct to say score it with the stresses? Could two people come to different interpretations of where the stresses fall?
Yeah, so it's called scansion is the activity of like that's the verb, scansion. Yeah, scansion is the activity of you know, figuring out the stresses and whatever in the slacks. So the opposite of a stress is a slack. That's the word. Yeah, so there are definitely poems where there is going to be a little bit of debate about what's what, right? But generally speaking, there's like something close to consensus. I would say. And that's just what I mean by it's like, it's where these things naturally fall, and like we mostly agree, you know? And so I also think that like I used to not be able to do it at all, right? So I used to have to teach poetry, and I was like, I can't believe that I have to explain scansion when I don't hear it at all. Like I just don't get it, you know? And it just eventually enough practice and thinking about it and reading aloud over and over, like made me realize like, okay, if I can just hear where the stresses are, that's really what I need. Because like the vast majority of poetry in English is iambic, right? And so once you have that, it's just like, you know, if you can catch the stresses, it's probably iambic, like it's probably regular. And then maybe once in a while you will catch a place where there's a disruption to it, right? Because that's the other thing I think for me with scansion is that it's like the things that are, in a way, like the things that are most interesting about it are the things that disrupt a pattern, right? Rather than like what the pattern actually is. So yeah, I mean, people kind of like clap along to things or like will beat something as they read, and like that's kind of like where there's a way that you can kind of signify the stresses that way, or kind of try to feel the stresses like through your body almost.
Well, I think I actually kind of think that's cool as a drummer who has to listen to a lot of metronomes. I think might be part of the reason why I'm sort of gravitating towards poetry, because there is this metronome buried within the text.
Right. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Actually, is that there's something that's like, that's good, that it's like it's guiding you on how to perform almost. almost, right? Like if you're saying there's a metronome in the text, right? Like that's like what was telling me how to read, how I was reading, right? In a way, like it's like giving me a framework for that.
Sorry to slow you down with questions, but this is something that intrigues me, because not only do you have to figure out where the stresses and the slacks are in a scansion, but you have to figure out, like with drumming, what the tempo of a poem is, like how fast it ought to be read. And everybody's got a similar internal clock. When poetry is read or taught, is there, you know, in music, slower songs will be, I guess, somewhere below 85 BPMs, and like a faster song will be like 120 BPMs, and then like, you know, your mid range. So these aren't hard and fast rules, but
I know those things from teaching exercise classes and looking for music that has the right number of BPMs for like the work that I'm doing in an exercise classroom. But that's interesting. That's another story.
Is there anything like that done for when people learn poetry formally? Like, would a professor ever say, okay, we're going to do this at 75 BPMs, or we're going to do this at 105 BPMs, because that's like what makes the recitation of the poem that great? Or does a poet have to kind of find like that 1 BPM within that makes everything perfect, or do they adjust it from poem to poem? How does tempo work in poetry?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question, Luke. And I don't know. I've certainly never had anybody like teach me in that manner. But I think it'd be a really interesting experiment. Like, and I mean that. Like, I do think that like there's something interesting there. And I also think that like I talk really fast. So when I read a poem, it just goes really fast. So like that's my tempo. Is like, let's just keep it going, you know. And so the idea that I might need to slow down and pause is like uncomfortable, but probably good, right? Like it's a productive kind of discomfort, you know. But that's just out of my own sort of, you know, how I act.
Yeah, a lot of the dramatized poems that like I will encounter on YouTube or something like that are always done very slowly and very dispassionately, and it strikes me as kind of melodramatic, to be honest.
Sure.
I actually prefer the way that you recite, but you know, I'm just trying to get some sort of orientation for what's agreed upon.
I don't think. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for how there's like so many different ways, and then but I also think that's like, you know, that's the beauty of it, right? Like that's why I do literature. There's like there's so many different ways to interpret things, and then when you add oral performance to it, like then you have this whole other element of like, you know, the way you read it, the way I read it, are so aloud, are so different, and like those are going to lead to different interpretations potentially, right? Like yours allows for like this examination of the orthography, I think, and it really like highlights that, whereas mine is like, all right, let's figure out what's going on with this meter and this rhythm, right? Or it just like invites like a different set of questions that might all come together.
Well, I'll rein in my silly questions. I've learned so much, but let me take a step back and let you progress through the poem like you would like to. I hope we get to talk about the content. Because,
okay.
I will say that because it does seem to be rather interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I just wanted to cover though, like, the meter is called ballad meter. Every one of her poems. So this is a little bit of, you know, like, this is not something that you get from just reading the one poem, right? This is some actual background on Emily Dickinson. All of her poetry is basically in this meter, right? So it has the same, you know, 4-3-4-3 situation, pretty much all like 4-line stanzas. Also the rhyme scheme, right? And this is a little bit harder to hear, I think, in this poem because she's disrupting it a little bit, or she's really just like pushing at the edges of what counts as rhyme. But the rhyme scheme, right, should be, what is it, A, B, C, D, right? So like the short lines rhyme, the shorter 2 lines rhyme, and the other which you don't in each stanza, right? And so, but like one of the questions I was going to ask you, it was about like, does this poem rhyme, and like where are the places where it does, and like, and that kind of thing. And so I do kind of want to get into, well, I want to get into like what rhyme is for Emily Dickinson, but maybe that's something that we can just like put aside for a second and actually get into a little bit of the content. Because right now we're just like talking about what poems are.
Hey, it's fine. Like it's, if we want to take more time to do that, we can take time to do that. That's the beauty of this. And
Sure.
if it's too much for the audience, they can pause and come back to it.
Okay. Well, I think that we should get into what's actually going on, because
Okay.
the stuff that I want to say about rhyme is not purely formal. And so it actually, I think, fits in better if we spend a little bit of time talking about what's happening in these 16 lines, content-wise. Okay, so you've read it a few times, I think, and you've read it aloud now too, right? So let's just do, again, a pretty basic kind of setting the scene, right? Who's talking?
So that's not rhetorical. You want me to answer?
Not rhetorical. I want you to tell me.
Well, it's a strange poem because it seems like the person who's talking is the person passing between two realms. The person who is dying, and at the end they seem to report that they have died. It's very strange. It seems like we're getting a report from the other side of whoever this is.
Great. Yeah. So right. So the absolutely right. The first line, I heard a fly buzz when I died. Right. So we already have this person who is presumably narrating from the other side. Right. So that in itself, like, to me, like, that sets up something very strange here. Right. We don't know what it sets up, but I mean, it could set up, you know, that this is a ghost, or that this is a person in heaven or something like that, you know, and that could be a very serious thing. Like, that could be a very heady, big thing, right? But it could also be an absurd thing, you know, like, it could be this like impossible narrator, this impossible speaker who's somehow telling us the story, right? And that it starts with a fly buzzing, right, also is a little bit strange, you know, like, if we're thinking about it possibly being this like big transcendental thing, right, that it starts with, you know, the fly buzzing in the room is like, okay, like, there's something, to me, there's something a little bit weird. There's like a mismatch maybe.
Right, because you're thinking about, if you're sort of crossing over, or you're like going to the other side, that it would be more majestic than hearing some like insect at that particular moment.
Right. Like, where aren't we walking down the tunnel toward the light? Shouldn't Gabriel be here? Like, you know, but no, there's a fly. So, you know, so there might be something playful or weird or whatever. But it all, and like that, the person, so to me, it's like that the person is speaking from death is like I'm taking it as playful, I guess, almost like more than I'm taking it as like incredibly profound at this point. And where are they? Like, do you have a sense of that?
I assumed. I have to do a closer reading, but my impression was that they were they were in a hospital or at her sickbed or some. But maybe that was my impression. That could be totally wrong.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I mean, I'm poking you because we're doing this like a little bit Socratically or whatever. So I think that I would take it to be like in a bedroom in the deathbed. And yeah, it could be a hospital, I suppose. But we're at what, I don't know, 1850s probably. I'm not sure exactly when this one's written.
Probably at home. Yeah.
And so yeah, so the stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm, right? So that finishes up our first stanza. Who else is around?
I read it in the second stanza. We get the sense that possibly Jesus is there when the king be witnessed in the room.
Yes. Right. Yeah. So the king be witnessed in the room. So we might have, I don't know what's going on, right? Like, Jesus might be somehow present in this like physical pre-death realm, or like maybe we've already crossed over to somewhere and this room is something else entirely, right? But something that part of why I really like this poem is like this weird connection that it makes to some of my own work, I think, or that sounded bad, that my work resonates with it or whatever. Emily Dickinson.
That's okay. You might be the next Emily Dickinson.
I really like this part. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm, right? So this, like, I kind of want to dwell there for a second, right? Like, what is that? The stillness in the air between the heaves of storm, right? Like, this is being in the eye of a hurricane, I think, right? Like, it's like that but short period of time, right? When like everything's really crazy and then it dies down, but it's like really foreboding, right? Like, you know, it's something else is coming. Like, it's not over. Like, for a second you think everything's okay, but then it's like, oh no, it's gonna happen all over again, right?
Yeah, I would
so,
use the adjective eerie. That would like, because I'm just the other day I had 2 days ago I had a massive storm come up on me rather quickly, and like there was supreme tranquility right before it happened, and you knew something was about to occur, and lo and behold, just the slightest gust of wind took down the transformer and the neighborhood's entire power, and I saw it all come down. I thought the tree was going to crash on me.
Right. So, yeah. No. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, in the summer, this is the time of like those kinds of just like incredible weather events, right? So this like creates, you know, I was saying how like I take the first line to be this kind of funny, weird thing, and like maybe this is kind of playful, right? But then the stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm, right? Is that eeriness? Is something foreboding? Something is about to happen, presumably death, I think. And then so that it goes on, the eyes around had wrung them dry. Like, that's like one of my favorite parts of this, right? Because of the pun on eyes. Because I'm thinking of it as being like the eye of a storm, right? And now it has just like returned to, I think, actual people's eyes who are crying, right? So it's just made this move from like the actual stillness in the air to it being like, right, this simile, you know, that it's like the heaves of a storm, right? But then that, like, I just love these moments, like in any kind of, I was gonna say in literature, but just like any time in language, like when like the literal and the figurative like weave themselves together like that, you know? And so
I never would have noticed that. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's what, well, I mean, it's a different conversation, but like that's what my work is. Like that's like those moments are like why I do what I do.
Yeah, that's really exciting.
And so, yeah, that's what I've been trying to do for, you know, some years. So the eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm, my favorite word. So then that seems to return to what seem to be real human bodies in the room, right? Who are crying or done crying, maybe have been wrung dry, you know. And then breaths were gathering firm. So I don't know, is that's like getting ready for something, maybe? I'm not, you know, like pulling yourself together or something like that, like getting ready for someone's death, I guess. I don't know. For that last onset, right? Which I'm thinking is like the last onset of an illness or something like that, right? But then it's that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. So it's like, oh, okay, well, that's like not the onset of like bodily death, but the onset of some transcendental kind of event, right? Some kind of, you know, which, and then I guess those things are the same or whatever, or like that like, you know, threshold, I guess, right, might be, you know.
Yeah, I tend to just, to put it in the popular, I would think of the drawing on that idea of like, oh, like Jesus calling you home or something like that. That's kind of what came up in my mind. Yeah,
no, absolutely. But I think what I'm sort of pointing to is like that the switch from like like if the last onset is like something about like that's the last onset of an illness or which is also just interesting. I'm just thinking of this now, but the last onset is like the last beginning, right? Like an onset is like it's an initiation, it's a new thing, right? But it seems like maybe even I might even want to say that like that hyphen right there for that last onset hyphen when the king, right? That might be like this line between like like the end of like embodied imminent life, right? And then like crossing over to the other side, right? That might be like a place in which that is like being marked in some way, or being spoken, but also being marked, right? So when the king be witnessed in the room. So, and that's gonna kind of connect to another thing I like about the poem that I'm interested in, right? So the next stanza, I willed my keepsakes signed away, what portion of me be assignable, and then it was there interposed a fly, right? So we're back in like the human world, right? So I willed my keepsakes signed away, what portion of me be assignable, right? So like, right, that's like, I'm ready to go. Like I've written my will, right? I willed my keepsakes, you know. Like it doesn't seem to be that hard to do, but it's like, it is like it's a material thing, right? That like marks a kind of readiness for something else, right? But then signed away, what portion of me be assignable? Is another one of these things that seems to like move between them, right? Because like in a way, like that's just like that's a restatement of I willed my keepsakes. You know, you could take it that way, right? Like I've signed away what portion of me be assignable, so I've like put my lands in order, like I'm ready to be done, you know. Or it could be like, well, wait, what portion of you is assignable? You know, like there's some, I think, you know, ineffable, spiritual, whatever portion that's not assignable, right? So it's like, again, I think kind of like marking that, right? Sorry, I'm gonna shuffle some papers here.
What I thought was kind of interesting about this stanza is that like it's this very dour moment. I can imagine like if you know, like if you're not struck down suddenly, like there's going to be a certain sort of earnestness that goes along with like signing a will and saying, hey, you get this and you get that, and this is what's to be done with my body. And then it seems, I don't know if I'm reading it incorrectly, but it almost seems like kind of funny that this fly like comes and interrupts it.
Yeah, no, this is a hilarious poem. Like this is a very funny poem. Yeah. Okay. And I know I've like when I've taught this to groups of students before, and I'm like, it's okay, like you can laugh, like it's okay. You don't have to be like, it's so sad that she's dying. Like it's made up.
Yeah,
like, it's playful.
I can see like I could see someone just being like, okay, like I'm gonna die and it's gonna be like really dramatic and I'm gonna have like these perfect last words, and then this like this nuisance just like interrupts the whole the whole tenor of the entire passing.
Yeah, right. So exactly that to me, that is what's happening here, right? It's like she starts with the fly, and then we get back to this like, okay, we're ready to go, and like, you know, what portions of me be assignable? Like as in like there's some part of me that's not like ready to leave the human world, right? So what's the why? Like what is the like, if we're thinking about this being a poem that's like that's dramatizing or explaining like this transition, right? What's the deal with the fly? Like what do you think she's after?
I mean, the first thought that comes to mind, I haven't done any sort of personal analysis on this, but the first thought comes to mind is maybe interjecting the levity just so that we don't view death so ominously. That would be just my first speculation. I have no idea how accurate that guess is.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I think that's definitely like a part of what's going on here, right? But I think like because it has so many religious, it has all this religious stuff going on with it, right? Like we have the king being witnessed in the room, like which seems to be like a pretty, you know, Christian image, and that fits with like our sense of, you know, certain you know, popular images or whatever of what death is, right? To me, it seems like there's something more to it. Not just don't be fearful of death, but like this like hanging on to this thing, this dirty, annoying, like totally unpleasant pest. You know, this thing that we don't think about that much, or this thing that we always want to like get rid of, right? The fly. To hang on to that, you know, to keep that in the poem, right? Like, is to. You know, it just as you're saying, like it disrupts this like what seems like a very solemn occasion, right? But to me, it also sort of pushes against that narrative, right? Like it's like there's this attachment to the dirty, fallen, imminent, you know, fly-filled world, I think, and that's like part of my attraction to this is that like she has this real, and again, and this is a lot of this is coming from having read other Dickinson and knowing about her life and stuff, which I can get into, like that for her, like the nature in particular, but like just the world, like the imminent world is really important to her at the same time that she's really religious, and like she's always struggling with that like throughout her life. Like she's like not ready to just be like the spiritual is everything. Like she's like, I really like my garden, and these things are really beautiful, and I have these connections that are really important to me with my friends. Like, and so there's like she's attached to that now.
Yeah, and I don't know if you can speak to this at all because I don't know a ton about her biography and how it influenced her poetry. But the little that I was able to glean from Wikipedia was that she had kind of an unusual relationship with religion. She seemed to oscillate between periods of incredible piety to disappointment with religion. And I wonder if this poem in some way captures that pendulum swing. And I don't know if that's a proper way to think about her relationship with religion.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't. Yeah, I'm no expert on her life. But I see her as having a long struggle sort of with religion. That kind of comes down to like what I was just saying about like believing, I think, but like not being ready to like, but just like liking or having this sense of like whatever religion was brought to her, which is a sort of Puritan, New England kind of Calvinist Christianity, right? That I guess was much more about like a kind of austerity or whatever, like not having any kind of, human bodily whatever pleasures, and that she wasn't quite ready for that kind of extreme version of things, because she was like, the world is beautiful and pleasurable and like that may not be bad. And she also was into like, she kind of rewrote like scripture in like and replaced like the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost with like natural images and stuff like that, like stuff that could be seen as like really kind of extreme, but was actually, I think, like very pious in its way, but was just like about bringing that stuff sort of down to earth. So I wanted to read a kind of famous bit from one of her letters to her friend Abaya. I think I have it here.
Can I ask one question about the fly just before you do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you said you think the fly comes to represent the world. You don't. I just, the only reason why I'm asking this question is that you said that she sort of reimagined a lot of the symbols for Christianity. I just wonder if the fly could represent something else, like
absolutely, totally.
If the fly could it be Satan or Satan's thorn or something to that effect? I don't know if you have any opinion on that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about it actually being an evil image before. I had considered that like that it was a divine image. So.
And which divine image did you think it was?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm just thinking of it as being this like uninvited thing that's going to be there whether you want it there or not, that is getting in the way death is getting in, right? Like whether you're ready or not. And so, I guess I don't.
Well, maybe the fly represents death.
Yeah.
I mean, flies typically associate themselves with decay.
Right. Yeah. No, that's the thing that, right. That's the other thing too, is that, I can't believe I haven't gotten to yet, is like that, right, that flies are usually there after death. So there's a way in which this fly, right? Because like flies are like eating decayed bodies or whatever. And so there's a way in which this fly is like there too early. And yeah, you would think of like, or at least a large quantity of flies would be a sign of death and decay, right? But here, like, and maybe that's why I'm attached to the sort of paradox of it, I guess, of like the fly being this like reminder from the natural, from the human world, right? But it's also like a reminder of like bodily death, because it's like, right, like the fly, a fly marks the death of a body. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about spirituality, I guess. I mean, I guess we make that connection. I don't know. I certainly don't have, I'm definitely never going to come to like I've figured out the poem and now we're done kind of reading.
Yeah. You know what? I mean, that may be potentially a topic for someone else to take up. But yeah, interesting discussion point. Yeah. So yeah, why don't you read this letter?
Okay. So this is something she wrote to her friend Abaya. I am not unconcerned, dear A, upon the all-important subject to which you have so frequently and so affectionately called my attention in your letters. But I feel that I have not yet made my peace with God. I am still a stranger to the delightful emotions which fill your heart. I have perfect confidence in God and his promises, and yet I know not why. I feel the world holds a predominant place in my affections. I do not feel that I could give up all for Christ were I called to die. Pray for me, dear A, that I may yet enter into the kingdom, that there may be room left for me in the shining courts above. She's what, 16, 15, I think, when she wrote that letter. So just
Abaya. How's Abaya spelled?
how is Abaya spelled?
Abeye.
I think it's ABA. Find it.
It's not that important, but I just thought it was interesting. Wasn't that Kierkegaard's middle name?
Oh, it's ABIAH.
Oh, okay. It's a different spelling.
Yeah, Abaya root. So yeah.
Cool name.
Yeah. So
I always find it interesting when people are like, well, look, I'm not straight with God, but if you could just go and do the praying for me, then then maybe like God will put me in heaven. I think it's always, I have individuals.
I got poetry, right? So yeah.
I have individuals in my life, and they're just like, hey, Luke, I know you and Mr. Jesus are friends. So like, could you talk to him for me? And I'm just like, wait, you think there's some like power that, like, I mean, I just find it funny on so many levels, because like you believe enough in it that like maybe I can curry favor with something that you.
Do you think are people serious when they do that? Like, is that a serious thing that people?
Yeah,
like, oh, wow,
yeah. It sounds like that's what Emily just did.
Yeah. Well, I think that is what she did, but I also think there's a certain politeness, right, to like. I mean, that's part of my interpretation of it, I think, right, is that you can't just say, like, I don't believe to your, when you're living in this, like, New England Christian world, right? So there has to be a certain, like, piety to the, questioning, something like that.
I think in the way that I've encountered it before, it seems to be sort of a modern day form of superstition. It's like, I don't know if any of it's true, but it seems to work on some level. So you, like my Jewish. Yeah. My Jewish friends, you pray to your God. My Islamic friends, you pray to your God. My Christian friends, you guys. Full court press. I need all of you on board to help me through this. Right now. I'm not going to discriminate where the prayer and God comes.
One of them will get through. Yeah. I have my mom praying rosaries for me, like on the daily. So I think I'm covered.
I'm praying for you too.
Thanks. So. Let's see. I wanted to get to obviously the final paragraph, final stanza, but I also wanted to get to something about rhyme, and those can maybe happen together. So this final stanza: with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. My cat likes it. So that stanza has a very strong rhyme, right? So me and see, right? That's pretty spot on, right?
Yeah, and the imagery is pretty arresting as well.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. And then the window. I guess it's interesting because it seems like the narrator is reporting about like when things went black. And they were able to understand that they didn't even have perception anymore on some level, which was like they're able to sort of make a reporting of what death was like. It's like when people have like these near-death experiences, like where they like are dead for like 5 minutes and then they're resuscitated. Some individuals like see the pearly gates, and other individuals be like, yeah, it was nothingness. Well, I'm just kind of like, well, you're still reporting on nothingness, so it couldn't exactly have been completely nothing, but whatever. Right. There seems to be some consciousness that occurs. Yeah.
Right. No, so I mean, so there is, I mean, I think like, I guess I don't go that far into trying to figure out like, oh, like, where are they? And is this is this speaker, is it possible, because I'm like, no, it is impossible. Like, it is this absurd isn't the right word, but like, the conceit of this poem is not a realistic one, So, yeah, and that it's the fly, right? So I should have read the final line of the previous stanza, right, with that one, that there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. So the fly is getting in the way of that like movement toward the light, right? So that again is like my sense of like, oh, there's this thing about like the natural world that's like somehow, I don't know if it's screwing things up exactly, like it might be welcome, right? Because that's just it, is like you may not want to be. Like, I mean, the speaker does seem ready, having willed their keepsakes and signed away the assignables, but yeah, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. I'm not sure, I don't know that I have a good read on the final line, exactly, like that what And so something you mentioned earlier when you were just looking at the poem, you said how there's a lot of capitalized words, right? Which is totally true. And so here we have windows. The windows have failed, and the window is capitalized, right? And I feel like I think that like one of the C's should be capitalized, given the sort of like strange logic of that, of capitalization or something in this poem. But maybe this just sort of shows me that there isn't a logic to it. So yeah.
Why do you feel like one of the C's ought to be
capped? I'm thinking about, so the windows failed, right? So I'm thinking of like, you know, this fly came in through a window, like there's an actual window in the room that the fly is coming out of, whatever. And so, but that's not the window that failed, probably, if we have this, but maybe it is, right? Because we have this like fly that's like interposing between the speaker and light, which could be coming from a window, right? So there could be like an actual physical thing there that's happening. But then it seems that like then by being capitalized that like windows is this, you know, metaphorical thing, that there's something about like that's life, I guess, right? That's like the windows failing that's a threshold. Like that's the threshold that's being narrated here, maybe, right? And windows being an actual physical threshold, right? Like this is about a movement between. And so then I guess I could not see like them being, with it, both the C's being lowercase, like makes me think that like it's just about physical seeing. Like I guess I'm just thinking that like vision or like being able to see something beyond, right? Like seeing the light, like kind of the stuff that you're talking about, right? Like having some kind of connection to something transcendental or to something after life would be a capitalized S. But I don't know that there's actually a logic to the capitalization of this poem, so yeah.
I just did a quick tabulation, and it looks like only 4 of the 16 lines lack double capitalization.
Okay.
So they're all capitalized. Like the first letter of each sentence or phrase or whatever is capitalized in each stanza, but only then in 4 other ones is there not a second word capitalized. And this last one, is one of the sentences. I don't know what that means. That one fourth of the lines don't have double capitalization, but
right.
That seems to be something I'm picking up on.
Interesting, yeah. But yeah, between the light and me, that one doesn't have any, you know, that one.
And they occur mostly in the second half. Like if you look at the first stanza, I believe every one of them has at least 2 capitalizations in it.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure how. Yeah, like that one. Huh. Yeah, I mean, thinking about it like across over the whole poem, I'm not sure. Like, it would take a little while to kind of figure out or to try to make a case for like that being a particular pattern or what that pattern might mean. Because like I think what I don't know, what I get from it is like, this is kind of weird and this is unusual. It's kind of the same thing with the dashes. I'm like, it's not that like each dash means something in particular or has a precise, you know, role to play, but that overall that this poem has no periods and is all dashes, like that's pretty interesting, you know, like that seems to be about like doing something different, like not ending things, right? Like maybe that's something that's interesting that we could talk about, is that like I could not see to see dash like that, you know, like there's no, we're not tying a bow around anything like on this poem, I don't think. You know?
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I hadn't noticed
right?
that.
Like it's like, oh, there it is. So that's interesting. So this is going on, I think, too long for people to cut them.
No, I think we've done a lot of good work here. I said maybe it might be time to maybe tie a bow on things, even though this poem doesn't seem to want to do that. I guess what would you say in closing?
Well, something that something that maybe I wanted to get at, so this is going to introduce something new, but I'll try to make it quick, is that I wanted to talk a bit about how the form for this poem of her ballad meter, right, is, she keeps to the meter, I think, the whole time, but that the rhyme is supposed to be these end rhymes on the second and fourth lines of each stanza, right? But look at the first one, right? We have room and storm. So that's a little iffy, right? Then we have firm and room. That seems even further off to me, right? Then we have bee and fly, which like, you know, that's barely, it's only at that point because there's a pattern that seems to be established, or because I've read a bunch of Emily Dickinson and I know what to look for, right? That I'm like, those are supposed to go together, but why don't they go together? You know, like it's like a disrupted pattern, right? But then in the final stanza, it's perfect, right? So that seems interesting, that like maybe that's the way it is trying to tie a bow on something or whatever, is that it's giving you a little bit more, you know, like it's putting these things a little bit more closely together, right? And so, but I guess what I wanted to sort of offer, and maybe this is gonna be more of a question than a way to like kind of tie it up, is what is happening with rhyme with Emily Dickinson? Because this is something she does all the time, right? Like she's known for dashes, and she's known for what's called slant rhyme, right? Which is what this kind of thing is, you know, is that you're expecting these things to work together, but they're really just like pushing at the edges of like what you could even possibly consider to be rhyme, right? And so, but what I do think that she's doing is that she's working with rhyme that's like more than just the coincidence of vowel and consonant sounds in stressed syllables at the ends of lines, right? Which is like roughly, you know, kind of definition of what we think of as rhyme, right? That for her, rhyme can be in our expectations, that like by using this form, like these things do rhyme because of the way that the stress falls on them, right? But even more interestingly, it could actually be there could be something about the similarities in the concepts, like that there could be something about semantics that's rhyming. So that there's actually that rhyme we think of as being a totally formal feature. We don't think about like what the words mean as having anything to do with what rhyme is, right? But for her, there might be something about like putting these words together in these places that's doing the work of rhyme. And to me, like that's so much of what Emily Dickinson is up to, like across all of her poetry, is like making these connections between like often disparate things, but also like leaving space for those connections to not be quite right, like for them to be kind of messy, right? Maybe I can end by just reading one of her other poems, which is, this is number 1263. And many people read this as her kind of like Ars Poetica or whatever. So tell all the, it's number 1263. So the first line is its title, so I'm just gonna go for it. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
The truth must dazzle gradually.
Yep.
Shit. Yeah, Kierkegaard would love her.
Good. Well, I'm glad you like it. That ends on a dash too. So yeah. So all right. I hope that was a good exploration of Emily Dickinson. I had a good time.
Yeah, that was incredible. Can I like clap? If you're watching or listening to this in your car or at home, I mean, keep your hands on the wheel, but I mean, if you're at home, clap along. That was awesome. I should figure out how to cue like a clap track or something like that. That was quite a performance.
I'll require it for the next one. Cool. Well, thanks for doing that. I mean, you did great too. So yeah.
I learned a lot. That was awesome.
All right. Cool.
Okay, I'm gonna let this record to YouTube, and then I'll put it on the Noetic app. Okay.
All right. Bye, everybody.